Vivian clutched her pregnant stomach as the cold marble floor of the Seoul office pressed against her cheek. The world was spinning, her vision blurred by the sweltering heat Director Park had refused to fix. She didn't expect a helping hand, but she didn't expect the heel of a designer shoe to click inches from her face. "Get up, you useless stain," Director Park sneered, his voice dripping with a racism that had poisoned Vivian's life for years. Instead of calling a medic, he tossed a handful of loose change onto her trembling back. "You're fired. Take your drama and your kind out of my sight. You were a diversity mistake I'm finally fixing." As security dragged her toward the rain-slicked streets of Gangnam, Park laughed, thinking he had finally crushed the woman who didn't fit his clean Korean empire. He had no idea that the silent project lead he just humiliated was the only thing standing between him and total destruction. Vivian reached into her pocket and pressed a single button on her phone. Miles away, in a fortress of glass and steel, Jun-ho, the almighty Korean Mafia boss, saw his wife's distress signal. His eyes turned to ice. Park thought he had just fired at nobody, but he had actually just declared war on the most dangerous man in the country. The Mafia boss was coming for his queen, and he wasn't just coming for an apology, he was coming to erase Park's entire world from existence. The rain in Seoul didn't wash away the shame, it only made the metallic taste of Director Park's severance coins more bitter as Vivian knelt in the downpour. To the onlookers in the lobby of Park Industries, she was just another broken employee. But to the man watching from the tinted windows of a black sedan across the street, she was the center of the universe. For 3 years, Vivian had lived a double life. By day, she was the brilliant, hard-working project lead who endured Director Park's weird office rules. He had moved her desk to the supply closet because her vibe didn't match the company's aesthetic. He made her work through the Chuseok holidays while everyone else went home, mocking her for having nowhere better to go. Vivian took it all with a silent grace that Park mistook for weakness. She wasn't staying for the paycheck, she was staying because she wanted to build a legacy for her unborn child on her own merit, without using her husband's terrifying shadow as a crutch. But today, Director Park had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Inside the boardroom, Park was already celebrating. He poured a glass of expensive whiskey, laughing with his assistants about how lightweight Vivian was for fainting. She thought she was untouchable because of her talent, Park sneered, wiping a smudge off his desk. But in this city, blood and status are everything. She's gone, and her little project? I'll put my name on it and sell it to the highest bidder by morning. He had no idea that at that very moment, the highest bidder was already standing in his lobby. The elevators didn't just open, they hissed with a predatory precision. A group of men in sharp, midnight blue suits stepped out, led by a man whose presence made the air in the building feel heavy and cold. This was Jun-ho, the almighty Korean Mafia boss. He didn't look like a criminal, he looked like a god of war dressed by a tailor. As Jun-ho walked toward the reception desk, the security guards, the same ones who had just pushed Vivian into the mud, froze. They recognized the gold dragon pin on his lapel. It was the mark of the underworld's silent owner. "I'm here to see Director Park," Jun-ho said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sent shivers through the room. "I believe he just threw away something that belongs to me. And I've come to collect the interest on his debt." The promise of the story was clear. Park had spent years being a bully, but he was about to realize that the woman he called trash was the wife of the man who owned the very ground he walked on. The dragon had been awakened, and Seoul was about to watch a kingdom fall. The glass doors of the lobby hissed open as Jun-ho stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a sudden drop in temperature. He didn't pull out a weapon. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of his authority made the air feel thin. Behind him, a line of men in dark suits stood like stone statues, their eyes fixed forward. The 2 security guards who had just dragged Vivian toward the door froze. They recognized the gold dragon pin on Jun-ho's lapel, the mark of the almighty Korean Mafia boss. Their hands began to shake, and they quickly let go of Vivian's arms. "On your knees," Junho said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a terrifying edge that brooked no argument. The guards didn't hesitate. They dropped to the marble floor, their heads bowed in shame and terror. Junho ignored them, walking straight to Vivian. He knelt beside her, his expression softening as he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Gently, he lifted her into his arms. "I have you now, my queen," he whispered. Outside, a private medical team rushed in with a stretcher, moving with military precision. They carefully took Vivian from him, heading toward an armored ambulance waiting at the curb. Junho stood up and turned his gaze toward the cowering guards. One of them began to stammer an apology. "We were just following Director Park's orders, sir. We didn't know." "I know exactly what you did," Junho interrupted, his eyes turning back to ice. "In fact, I have watched everything for the last 3 weeks. I knew about the shame corner. I knew about the missed lunches and the broken air conditioning." The guards looked up, confused. If he knew, why hadn't he stopped it sooner? Junho seemed to read their minds. "My wife wanted to prove she could win on her own. I respected her strength enough to wait for her signal. But Park has mistaken her grace for weakness. That was his final mistake." He walked over to the spot where Vivian had fainted. There, scattered across the floor, were the coins Director Park had thrown at her back. Junho reached down and picked up a single, dusty 501 coin. He turned it over in his hand, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. The guards watched him, trembling, wondering if this was the moment their lives would end. But Junho simply pocketed the coin and looked up toward the top floor, where Director Park was still laughing in his office. "Tell your master to enjoy his last hour of wealth," Junho said to the guards. "Every cent Park owns will be returned to him, in blood." Director Park leaned back in his velvet chair at the most expensive bar in Gangnam, swirling a glass of golden whiskey. He laughed loudly, entertaining a group of his sycophants. "You should have seen her face," he bragged, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye. "She hit the floor like a sack of bricks. I told her she was a diversity mistake, and then I literally threw the trash out. It was the most satisfying moment of my year." His friends joined in the laughter, raising their glasses to his bold leadership. Park felt like a king. He had finally gotten rid of the woman who made him feel inferior with her talent. To celebrate, he signaled the waiter. "Another round of the most expensive blue label for everyone," he commanded, sliding his sleek, titanium black card onto the silver tray. The waiter returned minutes later, looking nervous. He leaned in and whispered, "I'm sorry, Director Park, but the card was declined." Park's face turned a bright, angry red. "Check it again." "That card has no limit," he barked, drawing the attention of the entire bar. But as he reached for his phone to call the bank, the device began to vibrate uncontrollably in his hand. One notification after another flashed on the screen. His private equity accounts were frozen. His luxury vehicle lease had been terminated. Then, the most shocking alert of all appeared, notice of immediate eviction and asset repossession. "This is a mistake," Park hissed, his heart beginning to drum against his ribs. "I own that penthouse." He scrambled to find the deed in his digital files, but his fingers froze when he saw the name of the holding company that owned the land his building sat on, the Silver Dragon Group. He had never heard of it, but as he scrolled deeper, he found the truth. The landlord he had been paying millions to for years was a shell company owned by Junho. The almighty Mafia boss hadn't just moved into Park's neighborhood, he had been the secret owner of Park's roof all along. Sweat poured down Park's neck as he sprinted out of the bar, leaving his confused friends behind. He hailed a taxi, his mind racing. Surely, if he could just get inside his home, he could call his lawyers and fix this. But when the elevator opened on the top floor, Park's legs nearly gave out. The heavy, gold-plated doors to his penthouse were wide open. Two men in dark suits stood guard, their faces as cold as stone. His expensive Italian leather shoes, his designer suits, and his silk ties were scattered all over the hallway carpet. The locks had been replaced with biometric scanners he no longer had access to. A single suitcase sat on top of the pile of his belongings, with a note pinned to it in elegant handwriting. It was the same way he had tossed Vivian's life into the rain just hours ago. Park stood in the hallway of his own building, a homeless man in a $3,000 suit. The sun had barely risen over the Seoul skyline when Director Park burst through the doors of his corporate headquarters. His hair was messy, and his expensive suit was wrinkled from a night spent in a cheap motel. He didn't care about his appearance, he only cared about power. "Call the board," he screamed at the trembling receptionist. "I want an emergency meeting right now. I want that Mafia thug arrested for trespassing." He charged toward the top-floor boardroom, convinced that his wealthy directors would help him crush Junho. He imagined them standing behind him, ready to use their political influence to restore his kingdom. But when he slammed the heavy oak doors open, the scene inside drained the blood from his face. The room was deathly quiet. His 12 board members, men who usually acted like untouchable giants, were sitting perfectly still. Their hands were flat on the table, and their faces were pale with terror. At the head of the long table, in the very chair that belonged to Park, sat Junho. The almighty Mafia boss was calmly smoking a thick cigar, the gray smoke curling around his cold, sharp features. He didn't even look up as Park stumbled into the room. "Get out of my chair!" Park shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. "You think because you own my apartment, you own this company? These men report to me. I built this empire." Junho slowly exhaled a cloud of smoke and flicked the ash onto the polished mahogany table. "You didn't build anything, Park," he said, his voice as smooth as velvet and as dangerous as a blade. "You were simply a loud, angry man that I allowed to stay in that seat. For 5 years, I have been the silent majority shareholder of this firm. Every expansion, every contract, and every paycheck you thought you signed was actually approved by me." Park staggered back, his eyes darting to the board members. "He's lying. Tell him he's lying." The oldest director looked down at the floor, refusing to meet Park's gaze. "He's not lying, Park," the man whispered. "He owns 51%. He always has." The realization hit Park like a physical blow. The dragon hadn't just arrived, the dragon had been the shadow behind him for years, watching him mock Vivian and abuse his staff. Junho stood up, leaning over the table until he was inches from Park's face. "You used to joke that Vivian was a diversity hire because she didn't look like you," Junho said, his eyes burning with a dark fire. He turned to the board, who immediately sat up straighter. Effective immediately, Director Park is no longer the boss. In fact, he is our new diversity case. Let's see how he likes being the minority in a world that hates him. Director Park scrambled to the front of the room, his hands shaking as he grabbed a tablet. "You can't do this," he yelled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I am the only one who can save this company. I have the billion-dollar design project for the Seoul Landmark Tower. Without my genius, this firm is worthless. The investors are waiting for these files." He tried to open the main server, but a bright red light flashed on the screen. A message appeared in bold letters, "Biometric scan required." Park pressed his thumb against the glass, huffing with effort. The screen turned red again. "Access denied." He tried his other thumb, then his index finger, his face turning a sickly shade of purple. The tablet remained locked. "The system is broken." Park screamed, throwing the tablet onto the table. "I am the director. Why won't it recognize me?" "Because you didn't create those designs, Park," a calm, feminine voice rang out from the doorway. The heavy doors swung open, and the entire boardroom gasped. Vivian walked in, but she was unrecognizable. Gone was the tired woman in the rumpled office clothes. She wore a flowing, emerald green silk maternity dress that shimmered like a jewel. Her hair was styled perfectly, and her eyes held a spark of iron-hard confidence. She wasn't walking alone, she held Junho's hand, and he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. Park was paralyzed. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. He watched in total shock as the woman he had kicked into the mud walked straight to the head of the table. She didn't look at Park with anger, she looked at him with pity. "You spent 3 years calling me a diversity mistake," Vivian said, her voice steady and clear. "But while you were at long lunches and bars, I was the one building the future of this firm." She reached down and placed her thumb gently on the tablet. The screen instantly turned a bright, welcoming green. Access granted. The massive holographic display in the center of the room flickered to life, showing the beautiful, complex blueprints of the billion-dollar tower. The board members leaned in, amazed by the detail. "Wait. No." Park lunged forward, but Junho's men stepped into his path, blocking him with a wall of muscle. Vivian didn't hesitate. Her finger hovered over a large, glowing button labeled permanent delete. She looked Park right in the eye, the same way he had looked at her when he tossed those coins at her back. "You said I was trash," Vivian whispered, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. With one soft tap, the blueprints vanished. The screens went dark, and the servers began to wipe themselves clean. "Now your company is just an empty bin." The reality of his situation hit Director Park like a bucket of ice water. As the boardroom screens went dark, he realized he wasn't just losing his job, he was losing his life. He didn't wait for the security guards to move. He turned and bolted out of the room, stumbling over his own feet as he sprinted toward the emergency exit. He had a secret stash of emergency cash in a safe at a nearby hotel, and he had a private jet contact on speed dial. If he could just reach the border, he could disappear forever. 2 hours later, Park was at Incheon International Airport, drenched in sweat and wearing a cheap hooded sweatshirt he had bought from a convenience store. He kept his head down, clutching a small bag of cash and his blue passport. He pushed through the crowds, his eyes darting around for any men in dark suits. He reached the automated gate, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Just let me through," he whispered, sliding his passport into the scanner. Instead of a green light, a loud, piercing alarm echoed through the terminal. Red lights began to spin overhead. Within seconds, 4 airport security officers surrounded him. "Director Park. You need to come with us," one officer said, grabbing his arm. "There must be a mistake." Park shrieked, struggling against their grip. "I am a high-ranking businessman. I have a flight to catch." "Your passport has been revoked by the Ministry of Justice," the officer replied coldly. "You have been placed on the national no-fly list. You are under investigation for massive money laundering and financial fraud." Park's knees buckled. He realized then that Junho's reach wasn't just in the dark alleys of the underworld, the almighty Mafia boss had his hands on the very gears of the government. Junho hadn't just taken his company, he had turned the entire country into a cage. The officers didn't take him to a police station. Instead, they led him to a back exit where a familiar black armored sedan was idling. The airport police handed Park over to 2 men in midnight blue suits without saying a word. Park was shoved into the back seat, a black hood pulled over his head. When the hood was finally ripped off, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and seawater. He was in a dimly lit warehouse at the edge of the shipping docks. His hands were tied to a heavy wooden chair. In front of him, sitting on a crate with a shadow falling across his face, was Junho. The Mafia boss leaned forward, the light catching the gold dragon pin on his chest. "I told you the world was small, Park," Junho said, his smile cold and sharp as a razor. "But did you really think you could run away from the ground I own?" The warehouse doors groaned open, revealing the bright, harsh lights of the office lobby where it had all started. Director Park was dragged inside, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. Waiting for him was every single employee he had ever insulted, mocked, or overworked. They stood in a wide circle, their faces cold and silent. In the center of the room sat Vivian, looking like a queen on a throne, with Junho standing behind her like a dark shadow. "You have two choices, Park," Junho said, his voice echoing through the lobby. "You can face my version of justice in the docks, or you can offer a traditional apology. 100 bows. Every single one must be perfect. If you stop, we start again from zero." Park looked around the room. He saw the faces of the people he had called trash. His pride was screaming, but the sight of Junho's men at the exits made him crumble. He slowly bent his knees and lowered his forehead to the cold marble floor. "One," the crowd whispered in unison. As Park rose for the second bow, he felt a small, hard object pressed against his ribs. It was a tiny digital recorder he had hidden in his pocket earlier, hoping to catch Junho making a death threat. If he could get a recording, he could still win. He tried to adjust it secretly, but a hand like a vice gripped his shoulder. One of Junho's men reached into Park's pocket and pulled out the device. Without a word, the man smashed the recorder directly into Park's cheek, drawing blood and shattering the plastic. "No tricks," the man growled. Park sobbed, his face bruised and his body aching. He continued to bow, over and over. His back felt like it was on fire. His knees were raw and bleeding. 20 bows. 50. 80. The employees watched in total silence, the only sound being the heavy thud of Park's forehead hitting the floor. By the time he reached 98, Park's vision was swimming. His breath came in ragged gasps. He tried to push himself up for the 99th time, but his muscles gave out. He collapsed into a heap, his face pressed against the same floor where Vivian had fainted just days ago. I can't," Park wheezed, tears dripping onto the marble. "I'm too tired. Please, let me stop." Vivian stood up from her chair and walked slowly toward him. She stopped just inches from his head, looking down at the broken man. There was no anger in her eyes, only a cold, hard truth. "You can't?" Vivian asked, her voice quiet but piercing. "I was 8 months pregnant, and you made me stand for 4 hours in the heat. I had to finish my work while I was fainting. You're just a man with a bruised ego. Keep going, Park. Why can't you do what you forced me to do?" The sound of sirens wailed outside the lobby, their blue and red lights flashing against the glass walls. For the first time in hours, a spark of hope lit up in Director Park's eyes. He scrambled to his feet, his knees trembling and covered in dust. "The police," he gasped, pointing a shaky finger at Junho. "You're all finished. Arrest them. Arrest this Mafia thug for kidnapping me." A group of high-ranking officers marched into the building, led by a detective with a stern face. Park ran toward them, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Help me. They forced me to bow. They stole my company," he cried, reaching out for the detective's arm. The detective didn't move to help him. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing 2 officers to move past Park. They walked straight to Vivian, who was holding a small, silver hard drive in her hand. "Detective Lee," Vivian said, her voice calm and professional. "Everything you need is on this drive. It contains 3 years of digital evidence, including the double-book accounting files and high-definition recordings of every illegal transaction made in this office." Park's heart stopped. "What? No, she's lying. She was just a project lead." The detective looked at Park with pure disgust. "We aren't here for the Mafia, Park. We're here for you. We've been reviewing the files Vivian sent from her station in the basement." We have you on tape admitting to taking kickbacks from construction firms and purposefully sabotaging the pensions of your multicultural staff. Your own voice is on these recordings, calling your employees disposable animals. The room went silent. Park looked at Vivian, and the truth finally crashed down on him. All those months he had forced her to sit in the shame corner of the basement, he thought he was punishing her. He thought he had hidden her away where she couldn't be seen. But in the darkness of that basement, Vivian had been the one watching him. She had used her position to map out every single one of his crimes. She hadn't been a victim trapped in a closet, she had been a hunter waiting in a blind. You never even looked at my work, did you? Vivian asked, her eyes cold. If you had, you would have seen that I was tracking every cent you stole. I stayed in that basement because it was the perfect place to watch you fall. As the officers grabbed Park's arms and clicked the heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists, the weight of his mistake crushed him. He realized that Vivian hadn't just been an employee or a wife. She had been his undercover executioner, and he had handed her the rope himself. Park was being led toward the police cruiser, but he was still desperately clawing for a way out. My assistants, he shouted, straining against the handcuffs. They can explain everything. They know Vivian is the one who forged those documents. Call Secretary Min. Call the legal team. He looked at the crowd of employees, searching for the faces of the people who used to bow to him and laugh at his cruel jokes. Secretary Min stepped forward, but she didn't have a phone in her hand. She held a stack of signed legal papers. It's too late, Director, she said, her voice finally free of the fear that had defined her for years. We've already spoken to the prosecutors. Every one of us has signed an affidavit testifying to your crimes. We told them how you forced us to hide the money and how you treated Vivian. Park's mouth fell open. You traitors. I paid your salaries. No, Secretary Min replied, glancing toward Junho. The new management is paying our salaries now. We don't have to lie for a bully anymore. Park felt the world spinning. He looked around for anyone who would stand by him, but every face was like stone. Just then, a sleek white car pulled up to the curb. Park's eyes lit up with a final hope. My wife. My wife is here. She'll get me the best lawyers in Seoul. A woman stepped out of the car, looking elegant and cold. She didn't run to him. She didn't cry. She walked up to Park and handed a thick envelope to the police officer holding his arm. Give this to him, she said, not even looking Park in the eye. Park ripped the envelope open with his shaking, cuffed hands. It wasn't a list of lawyers. They were divorce papers, already signed and stamped. Tucked inside was a second document, a massive bill for millions of won in secret gambling debts she had accumulated in his name. I'm not going to prison for your life, Park, she said quietly. And since Junho owns the house now, I've already moved my things out. You're on your own. She turned and walked back to her car without a second glance. Park stood on the sidewalk, the cold rain starting to fall again. His company was gone. His employees were his enemies. His wife had erased him. He looked down at the ground, and in the dim light of the street lamps, even his own shadow seemed to disappear into the darkness of the wet pavement. He had spent his life stepping on others to feel tall, but now, there was no one left to look down on. He was truly, completely alone. The courtroom was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning as Director Park was led to the defendant's table. He looked pathetic. He had grown a messy beard, and his eyes were bloodshot. As the judge took her seat, Park leaned over to his court-appointed lawyer. Remember the plan, he hissed. I'm going to act like I've lost my mind. I'll tell them the stress of the company made me snap. They'll send me to a hospital instead of a cell. When it was his turn to speak, Park began to twitch and mutter to himself. He stood up and pointed at the ceiling, shouting about invisible voices and ghosts in the boardroom. He even pretended not to recognize his own name. The spectators whispered in shock, and for a moment, Park thought his plan was actually working. He just needed one professional to back up his story. The prosecution called their key witness, Dr. Han, a world-renowned psychiatrist who would evaluate Park's mental state. Park smirked to himself. He would fake a panic attack, and the doctor would surely recommend a mental health facility. Dr. Han stepped to the stand, looking sharp and professional. But as the doctor adjusted his glasses, Park noticed something that made his heart drop. Under the sleeve of the doctor's white coat was a small, sharp tattoo of a gold dragon tail, the same mark worn by Junho's inner circle. Park's jaw tightened. He realized that even the medical world wasn't safe from the almighty Mafia boss. The man who held his fate in his hands wasn't just a doctor, he was a high-ranking member of the organization Park had tried to cheat. Dr. Han looked directly at Park, his eyes cold and knowing. He didn't ask about voices or ghosts. Instead, he pulled out a thick folder of evidence. "I have spent 48 hours observing the defendant," Dr. Han told the judge. His voice was calm and steady. "I have reviewed his bank records, his private messages, and his behavior in custody. Director Park is not suffering from any mental illness. In fact, his attempts to fake insanity today are calculated, cold, and extremely precise." Park jumped up, forgetting his act. "He's lying. He's one of them," he screamed, his voice clear and perfectly sane. The judge slammed her gavel, her face like stone. "Sit down, Mr. Park." Dr. Han turned back to the judge and delivered the final blow. "In my professional opinion, the defendant is perfectly aware of every crime he committed. He didn't lose his mind, he simply lost his power. He is perfectly sane, and based on the evidence, he is perfectly guilty." Park was back in his holding cell, pacing like a caged animal. He knew the trial was a disaster, but he had one last card to play. Years ago, he had buried a small bag of cash under a floorboard in an old warehouse. Using his one phone call, he contacted a low-level thug from the streets. "I don't want her dead," Park hissed into the receiver, his eyes twitching. "Just scare her. Go to the hospital where Vivian is staying. Make her feel the same terror I feel. If she's too scared to testify, the case falls apart." The thug agreed, and Park spent the next few hours huddled in the corner of his cell, a twisted smile on his face. He imagined Vivian's face turning pale as a man in a mask burst into her private suite. He wanted her to know that even behind bars, he could still reach out and touch her. He wanted to prove that Junho couldn't protect her every second of the day. Late that night, the heavy iron door of the holding area creaked open. Park jumped up, expecting to hear news of a panicked hospital or a crying woman. Instead, he saw a young man in a leather jacket being escorted in by the guards. Park recognized him instantly, it was the thug he had hired. But the man wasn't in handcuffs. He was walking freely, and he was carrying the bag of cash Park had hidden. The young man stopped in front of Park's cell and bowed respectfully, not to Park, but to someone standing in the shadows behind him. Junho stepped into the light, his face as calm and terrifying as a deep ocean. "Looking for this?" Junho asked, taking the bag of money from the young man. He looked at Park with eyes that promised a nightmare. "This boy isn't a street thug, Park. He's a trainee in my organization. He's been following my orders since the day you first stepped into that warehouse. Every move you make, every person you try to call, it all comes back to me." Park's legs gave out, and he collapsed against the cold bars. He realized with a sickening thud in his chest that his last move had been nothing more than a trap. He hadn't sent a threat to Vivian, he had sent a confession of his own malice directly to her husband. Junho stepped closer, his shadow falling over Park like a shroud. He reached through the bars and grabbed Park's collar, pulling his face tight against the cold metal. His voice was a whisper, but it felt louder than a scream. "I gave you to the law because my wife wanted a fair trial, Junho said. But you just tried to touch my wife again. Now, the law can't protect you from what happens next. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the final verdict. Because of the evidence of his many crimes and the attempted attack on a witness, Director Park was sentenced to life in prison without any chance of parole. As the guards clicked the heavy shackles around his ankles, Park looked over at Junho, expecting to see a look of triumph. Instead, the Mafia boss simply checked his watch, as if Park's entire life was just a minor appointment he was finishing up. Before he was taken to the high-security prison, Park was forced to sit in a small, gray room. A large television screen was mounted on the wall. Junho stood by the door, his hands in his pockets. You always bragged about your roots, Junho said quietly. You talked about your family home and the empire you built from nothing. I decided those things needed a new purpose. The screen flickered to life. Park's eyes widened as he saw a live video of his childhood home, the expensive, private estate he had spent millions to maintain. Huge yellow bulldozers were idling at the gates. A sign was already being hammered into the ground in front of the property. It didn't have Park's name on it. It read, "The Vivian Peace Park, a gift to the people." No. Park lunged at the screen, but his chains jerked him back. That's my legacy. You can't just tear it down. Watch, was all Junho said. With a deafening roar, the bulldozers smashed through the front walls. Park watched in horror as the marble pillars crumbled into dust. The roof he had worked his whole life to steal and lie for was crushed into a pile of worthless rubble in seconds. His empire was being erased as if it had never existed. It wasn't just a house being destroyed, it was the very memory of him. As the dust settled on the screen, the camera zoomed in on two figures standing on the edge of the ruins. It was Vivian and Junho. Vivian looked radiant, wrapped in a soft white coat. In her arms, she held a tiny bundle, their newborn baby. She looked at the camera, her expression calm and full of hope. She wasn't looking at the destruction, she was looking toward the new park that would grow where Park's greed had once lived. Park let out a raw, jagged scream that echoed off the concrete walls of the cell. He thrashed against his chains, watching the woman he had tried to destroy standing strong and happy on the literal ruins of his life. He was a ghost in a cage, while she was the queen of the world he had lost. A year had passed, and the skyline of Seoul looked different. At the top of the city's tallest glass tower, the old company name had been scraped away. In its place stood a glowing sign, "The Vivian Legacy." Inside the building, the air was no longer thick with fear. The dark supply closets were gone, replaced by bright, open spaces filled with workers from all walks of life. Vivian sat at the head of the boardroom table, the same place where she had once been mocked. Now, she was the chairperson of a global firm that had become the pride of the country. Her first act in power wasn't just a company rule, it was a movement. She worked with the government to pass a national, no-bully, law, ensuring that no boss could ever treat an employee like trash again. She had turned her pain into a shield for everyone else. Many people thought the company would fail without Park's aggressive tactics. They were wrong. Under Vivian's leadership, the firm's success had tripled. Without the trash weighing them down, the employees worked with passion. Investors flocked to the company, not because of fear, but because of its heart. The world finally saw what Junho had always known: Vivian wasn't just a talented designer, she was a visionary leader. While the world celebrated, life was very different for the man who had tried to bury her. Deep inside a cold, gray prison, a man with hollow eyes and a tattered uniform knelt on the floor. It was Park. He wasn't wearing designer shoes anymore. His hands were cracked and red from hours of hard labor. He held a dirty brush, scrubbing the endless miles of concrete hallways. A small, flickering television hung on the wall of the prison common room. Park stopped scrubbing, his breath hitching as a familiar face appeared on the screen. It was a live broadcast of Vivian's latest speech. She looked powerful and elegant, standing on a stage decorated with the symbols of the new law she had created. The camera zoomed in on her face, and for a moment, it felt like she was looking directly through the screen and into Park's soul. He clutched his scrub brush so hard his knuckles turned white. He was a janitor in a world she had rebuilt. "To anyone who feels small," Vivian said, her voice echoing through the prison halls and across the entire nation. "Remember this, they thought I was just a girl in the mud. They didn't realize I owned the ground they stood on."